Hi, welcome to part 3 of a 4-part series on the strategic themes of the Omni-win Project. The goal of the Omni-win Project is to help us co-create a future of democracy where everyone wins. That means we need to create a political culture that strives to include everyone, and it also means building the systems and structures and tools and processes that we need to be able to have conversations that include diverse perspectives. As far as I can tell, there are a lot of solutions and people and organizations and strategies, tools, processes out there already that can help us build the future of democracy. So my strategy is to help raise awareness of all these different things and get people to think about them and then put them in conversation with each other and hopefully help us actually accelerate the creation of the democracy for all of us. In the last 2 videos, I spoke about the processes and tools that we have already for having good collaborative communication. And in the last video, I talked about citizen-centered democracy and the systems that we have and the tools that we can use to make sure that people are at the center of the democracy. Real democracy, basically. Today I'm going to talk a bit about what it would look like to create an omni-win culture, or a culture that is dialed into our interconnectedness and trying to make sure that we're supporting each other in building the future that we want. So I'm going to talk a bit about culture. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges we have. Then I'm going to talk about some of the rad solutions that are out there and talk about what those solutions are missing and what some of these solutions really can offer us. So let's talk about culture first. Culture is basically a way of life for society. It's something that is acquired knowledge. It's something that we're passing down from generation to generation. And it's also something that we absorb and learn from those around us. So it has a kind of this viral effect of kind of moving around from individual to individual. And it's worth naming that there's culture at societal level, but then we also have culture within different spaces that we have, whether we're going to hip hop culture or office culture or the culture at your club or your golf course, whatever your culture might be. And then we also have our own idiosyncratic culture. Each of us have our own little way of seeing the world and being in things. So culture, I'm thinking about as having kind of 2 aspects. One is it teaches us what has meaning. It teaches us about our values. It shows us how we interpret reality and what we find to be important or salient or what stands out for us. And then that, in turn, leads to things that you can see from the outside, which are artifacts and behaviors. So we have like food and art and movies and all the artifacts of culture that we often can think of. But then there's also the institutions and the behaviors, the language we use. All of that is part of culture. And culture is an interesting place to be trying to change. One, it's very durable. And so changes that we can make can last very long into the future, but it also means that it's hard to change it. And it has that self-generating capacity so that if you can change something there, then it can spread out around. The other challenge about culture and thinking about our political culture is that the ways that we do things, it has this way of being intuitive or obvious or just seeming like it's hard to see it. That makes me think of the idea of a fish doesn't recognize that it's in water. If you talk to a fish about water, it's like, I don't know, this is just existence, right? Isn't this just the normal way to do things? So yeah, so I think culture is I think it's in a certain way like some of the most important things that we need to change if we're going to create a political culture for all of us or create a democracy that works for all of us. But it also is something that's hard to get people to see, and it's hard to change it. So let's talk about why we might want to change it. So there's a lot of different ways to think about what's the problems with our political culture, but there's kind of 2 big categories that I want to lift up. On one hand, we live in a culture that has a huge emphasis on our separation, on our individuality. This creates the us and them, or humans are separate from nature. And that also is connected to the idea of a win-lose dynamics or rivalrous dynamics, as some folks say. So on one hand, we have this issue of separation, rivalry. The other thing that's happening with our culture is that as we become more globalized, as we grow and more ideas are happening, it has this way of becoming increasingly complex. Things are just more and more, there's more and more variables, there's more and more things to consider. And so it's actually harder for us to really grok it, to really understand what's going on. And so this separation and rivalry is, first of all, leading to polarization, as you may notice. And there's also a way that with that kind of win-lose, which kind of has this right and wrong aspect, we also have a culture where we're like, there's a bit of a punishment culture, a revenge culture, or something that's, we're not giving people a lot of space for redemption, for being able to change. So we're really kind of organizing the world into the good guys and the bad guys. And that's one aspect. And then on the other hand, with this increasing complexity, there's a lot more confusion, and this is also impacting our information and technology is exacerbating this. We're also under a lot more pressure because we're facing an environmental crisis and all sorts of different crises. And so there's like a high pressure situation for us to need to fix things. And all of that together is creating what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls the meta crisis. And another way of thinking about this is a way that we could think about the kind of the rules of the game. One where we're trying to win against our enemies and we're kind of increasingly like accelerating through things. These are the elements of what is also called game A. Game A are the rules of our culture. And if we keep on following the rules of game A culture, we're going to lead to collapse. You can just driving right off the cliff. And so we actually need to change some of these cultural aspects. Let me tell you about some of the really cool things that I know that are out there. And if you have other ones you want to share, I'd be interested to hear about them that can kind of give us some better ways of responding to it. I'm going to explain this in both the sense of the interconnectedness, or how do we get out of separation, which is interconnectedness, and how do we deal with all of this complexity, which is kind of is increasing our ability to make sense of the world, or sense making. And these are some of the aspects of what would be a game B culture. I'll just quickly say that I'm not just saying game B right out of the blue. There's an entire movement around game B, and you've probably heard me talk about it if you're already tracking my things, but check it out. Game B is really amazing. But let's just think about what would be the rules of a culture that we want to live into that can help us navigate all of this complexity without getting into more complicated systems. Or what would be the rules of game B that create an infinite game? A game where instead of someone winning or losing, that we all want to play the game keeps on repeating and we can keep on going. What are the rules of the game that are good for everyone, are sustainable, and don't lead to this win-lose outcomes? So how do we get there? So in order to get out of this separation and rivalry aspect, we need to recognize our interconnectedness. We've had this idea of separation. We can kind of trace it back to the Enlightenment, but we also can trace it all the way back to the Fertile Crescent and the origins of civilization. But recent science and old-time spirituality and spiritual things show us that we are interconnected. We are all one. That is an indisputable truth at this point. And there's some really great frameworks for helping us understand that and how to actually live in to that sense of interconnectedness. One of those is the idea is coming from the world of integral theory. Integral theory is a bit more than I can get into right now, but there are ways of ways of thinking about our worldview that's like an integral level of worldview that is basically able to hold all of these different perspectives and see that they all have a role to play. There's other names for this. It's been called the post-progressive approach, as in like kind of the next level of thinking. Progressive thinking is like the one that includes all the different perspectives. People call it meta-ideological thinking. And I want to give a big shout out to the Meta-Ideological Politics podcast that Ryan Nakata is doing. It's also called meta-modernism. But you can basically think about it as a framework for holding all the different perspectives and basically saying, I like what's going on. I see some cool things about conservative thinking. I see some good things about progressive thinking. I see some good things about like mainstream thinking. And those all are really important. And I see the value in all of those. So one of the things I'll talk more about in this project is this meta-ideological perspective. What does it look like to hold all of the perspectives and see that they all have value instead of choosing one or the other? And there's some really great frameworks for doing that. One of the frameworks that's helpful for thinking about that is something called polarity thinking. Now, polarity thinking used to be called polarity management. It's developed by a guy named Barry Johnson. And right now there are some really great organizations that are taking polarity thinking and applying it to our businesses and to our democracy. So I'm going to give a big shout out to the Institute for Polarities of Democracy, who are applying this in really interesting ways. And also Steve McIntosh is someone who has been using polarity thinking to talk about our politics, especially around developmental politics and how we can create more cultural intelligence. Just quickly about the way that polarity thinking works is that we have some polarities are kind of like right or wrong or this or that choices. We do have choices we need to make in this life, but there are certain polarities that create this like kind of ongoing dynamic tension. And those polarities are called interdependent polarities. And with an interdependent polarity, both sides of the polarity actually define each other. They give each other meaning. And both sides of the polarity have something really great that they're offering to the system. And both of them have a shadow side. And the way that we tend to get stuck in polarization, and you might recognize this, is that someone will be focusing on the positive qualities of their side of the thinking. So someone who is conservative might be really recognizing the importance of traditional values, the importance of respecting our history and our culture and how we got here. And they look at the other side of the spectrum when looking at more liberal or progressive values, and they're only looking at the negative qualities of the other side. So they might be thinking, wow, I'm really concerned that this is some really risky behavior. Looks like we're trying things we haven't done before. Looks like we're not respecting the way that we got here or the path that got us to get here. We're not paying attention to the traditions, and that could be super risky. And similarly, progressives might be looking at, wow, we need to change. We need to do all these other future thinking things. We need to make sure that we're more inclusive. We need to be willing to change. While on the other hand, looking at the negative qualities of the other side. But the fact is that both sides have their positive and negative qualities. And part of the way of using this kind of thinking is to recognize that if you're advocating for just one direction, it's really worthwhile to pay attention to both your own shadow side and what's the positive sides of the other side. And these need to be in dynamic tension, because the truth is, using the examples from before, we are going to keep changing. We need to keep growing, and we need to hold on to what got us here in the first place. We need to make sure we hold on to those values. And that tension is always going to be here. We're always going to be stuck between trying the new thing or making sure that we keep track of the old thing. Now, a lot of political issues can be used by thinking with a polarity thinking lens. And that lens helps us be able to recognize the values of all of the things across the political spectrum. Some other things that I just want to lift up right here that can help us with this puzzle of separation and rivalry. One is systems thinking. There is a growing field of science that is taking a systems approach to looking at the world around us, and basically is seeing that anything that's part of a system, they're all interconnected, and all the different pieces are all impacting each other, and the system kind of functions as a greater whole, and then usually that greater whole is also part of a greater system. And again, I'll get more into this in future videos, but the whole idea of systems thinking helps us recognize that it's not just a question of us or them or either or, but it's, oh, we are interdependent. We have this kind of meta-ideological, integral understanding of all the perspectives, recognizing the interdependence of the polarities, and just recognizing interdependent of all the pieces that are part of a system. And this country, or any country, and the whole global community is one system, and we can't separate ourselves from one another. There's a couple other cool ways of things that are worth flagging here. One of them is nonviolence. I've made a bunch of videos recently about nonviolence, and that is kind of what happens when you actually apply that sense of interdependence and actually like bring it into one's behavior and try to make change through that. So nonviolence is not just, it's about making sure that I am loving my enemy or loving the person who sees me as their enemy, but it's also the most effective way of making change happen as well. And I also want to put a big shout out to the idea of social permaculture. Permaculture is used for agriculture, and it's a way of creating a little ecosystem that makes sure that everything is playing its different role, and all the different pieces of it are creating a sustainable way of going. And some of the principles of that are working with what you've got, paying attention to the different edges, and there's all these different aspects of social permaculture that can be applied to our society, and there's some really interesting outcomes when we do that. And I'll put some links about that as well into the, below here. And essentially the way that we get out of this separation and rivalry is that we lift up the importance of the fact that each of us need to be a sovereign individual that is also someone who is in relationship. And that is a dynamic tension that we're always going to be with. And so how do we be individuals in a relationship? And this is something that we need to learn and share and talk about within our culture. And we need to get out of this, these guys are good and these guys are bad. So what do we do about this crazy complexity that we're in? So as I said before, we have increasing complexity. This is exacerbated by the fact that we are just like continually growing and globalizing, and we are under high pressure, and it's intense. We're in very intense times. And the truth is, it's going to keep on getting more intense. We can make things easier, but as long as culture keeps on growing, and as long as we keep on connecting with various people with diverse perspectives, it's going to keep on getting more complex. And so we need better tools for making sense out of the world, even as it gets more complex and more confusing. So there's some really great things that are happening here. I want to make a shout out to, when it comes to Sensemaking, the work of Rebel Wisdom. They're doing some really great, they have a Sensemaking course, and they also have like tons of videos about it. There's a lot of great conversations about it. One of the things that's being lifted up when it comes around Sensemaking is the idea of heterodox framing or conversations. So orthodox would be like, this is just my way to do it and it's the right way. Heterodox is, let's pay attention to what all the perspectives are saying. And there's this recognition that all perspectives have a contribution to whatever the conversation is. And honestly, we can't actually make sense of it. We can't really understand what's ever happening unless we have listened to all the different perspectives. Now, that's a lot. And so I want to make some shout outs to just some really great work that is helping us show, like right now there's new systems and structures that people are coming up with A lot of these are happening like in the digital space, but there's a lot of great work to sort of help us understand the news and various kinds of information. The Consilience Project is doing some really great work on helping us understand how to navigate what is going on with all this information. And there's also some good websites that are helping show us, that can help you access multiple perspectives on different news stories. One of those is All Sides Media. And the other one is Flipside. I haven't looked at Flipside that much, but both of these are places where you can go learn, take a look at an issue, and you can read articles from conservative, liberal, mainstream, center, across the spectrum. You can see what different people are saying about it. And this is a wonderful practice in being able to sort of really understand what's going on and not just get into one's own perspective. Now, there's a lot of information out there, and we're stepping into increasing complexity. So none of this is necessarily easy, but it's going to be essential for us to continue going. So throughout the Omni-win Project, I'm going to be bringing you perspectives, experts, tools, and so forth that can help us try to make better sense of the world. So what's the point of all of this? So as I mentioned at the beginning, there are these 4 strategic themes for the project, and this work on shifting our culture is really important, but it doesn't answer all of the questions. So, and this is why we need all 4 of the strategic themes. So, one of the challenges that trying to shift our culture, or like trying to create an interconnected culture, is that it doesn't tell us how to do it. The folks and people who are advocating for Omni-win culture don't necessarily have the processes for actually applying this bridging of the divides. But that's why collaborative communication is one of the strategic themes. And one of the things that this culture perspective can really help with is it can actually give really interesting frameworks and tools that can help us do collaborative communication better and actually recognize why we need to be communicating collaboratively and why that's an important thing. This aspect of, again, like with these frameworks and kind of philosophical ways of approaching this, those are going to have to be institutionalized somewhere. And that's where the citizen-centered democratic systems comes in. And I think that some of this cultural work can be really helpful in guiding how we build some of those new systems that can teach us like what's important and how do we need to structure our new democratic systems. And some of the things that are coming up here are like more powerful digital tools, ways for large amounts of people to be sharing information and creating collective intelligence. And of course, this framework helps us recognize just the absolute importance of getting away from rivalrous solutions. There's way more advanced ways for us to be making decisions and participating in democracy that aren't just up and down voting. And the other part of this is all these different cultural frameworks. It's hard. It's hard to accept this. And so this is why we're going to have to do some of that shadow work. We're going to have to look at the part of us that doesn't really want to listen to the other perspective and doesn't really want to agree or doesn't want to admit that maybe we don't have all the answers. And so that's why we're going to look to the work of the growth of omnipartial individuals, and that'll be next week's video. But I do think that some of these cultural frameworks are very helpful in helping us normalize the fact that it's hard. This isn't easy to do. And it also helps us understand why there's so much complexity. But then it also helps us really start to understand how to navigate all of that complexity. And at least for me, recognizing that there's kind of broad cultural frameworks for this helps me not feel so alone in this kind of work. So this project is going to continue going forward. Next week, I'll be talking about how do we create omnipartial individuals and what is the individual personal change that's going to have to happen to create an omni-win future. But for now, please subscribe to this video, or come check out my Substack at omniwin.substack.com. And I'm going to be having a podcast coming out this summer. And in that, I'm going to be talking to experts from all these different fields. Some of these folks I already just mentioned in today's video. We're already recording interviews together. So you should stay tuned for that. And the best way to do that, again, is at omniwin.substack.com. Now, thank you for watching this video, and please stay tuned. And if you can think of other cultural frameworks or different ways of thinking about our interrelatedness, or great tricks for making sense out of the world, please tell me. I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.